are delighted to be partnering with the Book Festival again. We think that this is really important for our state. And at the risk of your hearing that for the second or maybe the fourth time this afternoon, let me tell you why. It's not just about literacy and firing the imagination. It's also about the breadth of ideas and the scope of those ideas, learning to think widely. We think that's important for our people in our state. And so thank you for being a part of this afternoon. And we hope that you'll come worship with us on any Sunday that you'd like.
Thank you, Reverend Stockett. I don't think anybody could have expressed that any more concisely or succinctly, the mission purpose of this book festival, than we just heard. But I'm Peyton Prosper on the board of directors of the book festival, and my lofty title is room coordinator, but I'd like simply to ask that you turn off cell phones if you have them, and to acknowledge that this book festival is dependent upon the good people like Reverend Stockett in Galloway Methodist Church and others, such as the Crooks Foundation with Austin Evans and Sarah Mel Evans. The Crooks Foundation was based in Meridian, and it's John Evans has been very close to it, and we're deeply appreciative of their support for this particular panel. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Todd Dowdy, to introduce our
dialogue and warm understanding of human foibles. Over the course of his legendary career, Mr. Russo has written 10 novels, 2 short story collections, and elsewhere, a memoir, among other books. His numerous accolades include the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and you may not know, he received an Emmy nomination for the TV adaptation of Empire Falls. Nobody's Fool was a film made into a film starring Paul Newman, and recently his novel Straight Man was adapted into an AMC TV show called Lucky Hank, starring Bob Odenkirk. Mr. Russo will be signing in the tent today at 4:15, and he will be interviewed by my friend and coworker, Valerie Walley, who is currently the Regional Field Sales Director for Knopf and lives here in Jackson. Valerie, one of the most well-read persons I've ever known, has worked at Penguin Random House for 27 years and counting, but before that, she was the second Lemuria employee hired by John Evans and worked at the bookstore for 13 years. So please give a very warm welcome to Richard Russo and Valerie Walley.
Thank you, Todd. I just want to say a big thanks to Todd, because he is such a supporter of this festival, and he is such an ambassador for us with all of the publicists that work with Penguin Random House in New York. So thank you very much, Todd. And now to my new friend, Rick Russo. We're so delighted to have you here. And I wanted to start off just by saying, I don't know how many of you have read his books. So we're going to talk a little generally at first, and then we'll get into the Fool trilogy and the new book. So I think there's a connection to be made for people who love Southern literature, for your books too. I think that, being set in small towns, having them be about neighbors that care about each other, that are a little idiosyncratic, maybe to say the least. I just think there's a connection to be made there, and I think your work is a good kindred spirit for our festival.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I hope that's true. Also, I just want to say thank you all for coming. This is an absolutely beautiful venue, and I'm going to, I think, have to watch my language in it a little bit, but we'll do our best. You know, when I was a young writer, one of the things that I didn't quite understand was who my audience might be. Since I was writing, it seemed to me I was writing for working class people in a part of the world that never got an awful lot of attention, upstate New York. I think a lot of people were interested in what I was writing because it seemed to them like I was looking at them, I was noticing them. Not an awful lot of people were. But I didn't know, so I was surprised to discover actually who my readers were, because they weren't the people that I thought I was writing for. But one of the things that surprised me after my first novel, Mohawk, and then The Risk Pool, was that when I would go on book tour, like I'm on right now, people would say about my Mohawk or my North Bath, I know that town so well. I know that town. I know those people. Really, you're writing about my hometown. And then I would ask them where they were from. And it might be Illinois, it might be Washington State, it might be Mississippi, and which always astonished me that they felt that they knew this place that I was writing about, and I think it finally came to me that that even though I'm associated with a place very deeply connected to my own region of upstate New York, that what I've always really been interested in is class. And if you get the class stuff right, class and place get confused, or they get confused a lot. But if you get the class stuff right, people they'll go right where you want them to go, and they will feel like you're writing about them. So I think that might be the connection. With my novel Empire Falls, I remember, too, thinking, because it was set in Maine, all my other books had been set in upstate New York, and because I set that book in Maine, and because Mainers are very, very protective of their state, and they're very prone to think of you if you weren't born there, never mind how long you've lived there, but if you weren't born there, they think of you as from away and are a little on the suspicious side. So when I set that novel, Empire Falls, in Maine, I expected a little blowback from that, frankly, and was stunned, actually, by the incredible generosity that lifelong Mainers felt towards that book. And again, I think it had to do with class, and if you get that stuff right, then people respond very generously in places.
Thank you. So, just speaking of influences on your work, are there any writers that influenced you, and in particular, any Southern writers that influenced you along the way?
Well, that's interesting. Pat Conroy, who blurbed an early, I blurb a lot of books. I get a lot of books sent to me by publishers, editors. I taught for a lot of years, so a lot of former students, a lot of colleagues, and all of that. I blurb a lot of books because I love discovering new authors, like to give them a hand up if I can. There were 3 writers who did that for me early on. There were more than that, but the 3 that gave me a kind of a hand up in my early career, Pat Conroy was one, John Irving was another, and my wonderful, great friend, the late Howard Frank Mosier, was another. And so certainly Pat Conroy, and Pat too was closer to me because Pat's work was very, very funny, and I'm a comic writer. There are a lot of Southern writers who I did my due diligence with and absolutely adored. That nevertheless, it's funny. I think a lot of writers do what I call triage. When you read something, you can rate it with wonderful, or even the things that happen to you in real life. You can read them, or things that can happen to you. And you say, this is what I just witnessed is really important. But then sometimes you say, okay, it would be important for somebody else, but not necessarily for me. You know, I can use we tend to divide things, or I do anyway, into things that I think might be valuable to me someday, having finally figured out who I am, and what my strong suits are. Then we have this kind of triage, and for speaking of writers whom I adore, Southern writers that I adore, I think of Faulkner, of course, because yes, Cormac McCarthy, certainly writers that I absolutely adore. But in terms of triage, I can be absolutely knocked sideways and bowled over, even as I think to myself, but what exactly can I use? What exactly would I steal? Because we all read with larceny in our hearts. And so those are writers that I just know I'm never going to be. And so in terms of that triage, they maybe weren't as important to me as someone like someone like Pat Conroy, whose sense of himself as at least in part a comic writer was invaluable to me when I was trying to figure out who the hell I might be.
So I'm going to skip, or just with Risk Pool, on the back of the cover, there is a full bleed picture of you, and there's a huge quote by Pat Conroy. And Pat Conroy says something to the effect of, I loved this book, I love these characters as much as I loved the characters in Garp, which if you remember back in the 80s, Pat Conroy, John Irving, The World According to Garp, those were huge, huge, huge. So that was a really nice thing. But previously to the Risk Pool, Mohawk came out, and I remember that very well because it was part of a series. It was part of a new series in publishing called the Vintage Contemporary Series. And these very innovative young editors were going to have this trade paperback series that was going to really, kind of revolutionize the industry. And so Mohawk was published into this series, and I was at Lemuria at the time, and there was a window display contest involved in the selling of the series. Yeah. So John's idea, John Evans, the owner, his idea was, we're just gonna stack these books up as high as we can and watch them fly. So for the window display part, we did stack them up on the table under the window, but we stocked all of them. We loved them. I read Mohawk, and I loved it. I loved it so much. I thought, if someone can write a book like this, I really want to be a bookseller. I want to be someone who can recommend books like these. So thank you. And I just wondered, what was it like? Did you know when you were going to publish Mohawk that it was going to be part of the series? The series also included Richard Ford, Tom McGuane, Jay McInerney, eventually Kay Gibbons, but it went on for years, and we may even still be using that imprint in some way at Vintage, but it was huge in the mid 80s and through, probably for the next 25, 30 years.
Yeah, I remember when I got a call from my agent, and my first novel was rejected, I think, 35 times. That book was rejected again and again and again and again. And my agent called and said that he had sold the book. sold it to Gary Fiskajohn, my longtime editor. Although by the time the book came out, he had moved on to another publishing house. But I remember being disappointed when I learned that it was going to be that there was not going to be a hardback of it. That's just how naive I was at that time, not knowing how incredibly lucky I was to be in that series. You saw Richard come in. Richard Ford was in, as you said, was in that series, which meant that Richard Russo got to coast on Richard Ford's coattails. And Jay McInerney's and Paul Marshall and all those wonderful writers who were in that series. It was one of the luckiest moments in a very lucky career that series I was too stupid to know just how lucky I was.
That's wonderful. We're going to talk about the Fool trilogy in a second, but there are other books that Rick has written that I'm sure many of you have read, and I just want to name those because they are major works, and you can start anywhere with any of his books. Even if you haven't ever read any of the Fool books, you can start with the new book. They are all wonderful. So I just want to read the names of these, just in case anyone may have read some of these and forgot. So Straight Man, which was, as Todd mentioned, just made into the AMC series. Bridge of Sighs, which is one of my personal favorites. That Old Cape Magic, Chances Are, and the two story collections are The Horror's Child and Trajectory, and a memoir about your mom, Elsewhere, and then a collection of nonfiction, The Destiny Thief. What's your favorite?
Ooh, well, I'm glad, first of all, thank you for mentioning Bridge of Sighs, because that one damn near killed me. I think sometimes we judge these novels by how much rectal bleeding they caused, and that one. So thank you for appreciating the pain and suffering that went into that. I remember sending it to my agent, and it was already 600 pages long, and it turned out to be 850 or so. And I said, Nat, I'm just at a loss here. It seems to me that I might have 3 books. And he said, no, it's one book. But there's something off about. You're the one who's separating these narratives. These narratives have to be told alternately. And I spent about, I'd say, 45 minutes on the phone with him explaining why that couldn't be done. And by the time I ended up explaining why it couldn't be done, I realized, of course, that he was right and it could be done. But that one was difficult. I'm not sure I have anything like favorites. When I think back on these books, what I remember more than anything else is, I think, who I was when I wrote it. I've been at this a long time. Every cell in my body has changed several times since that first book. I remember, for instance, about Empire Falls. I've forgotten an awful lot about that book. I haven't read it in forever. There was a period because the book was optioned. There was just a long period in my life when I was traveling with that book and talking about it and all of that. I've forgotten an awful lot about it. But what I remember about that book was that I wrote it at about the time when my daughters were first beginning to have private lives. It seemed like not that long before that our family dinners, that was the one thing we always did, my wife and I, we encouraged our kids to do as many things as they wanted to do after school and, clubs and whatever. But we did try to make a hard and fast rule that we always had dinner together. And, but there came a time, my daughters are only 2 years apart, there came a time, not surprisingly, along around junior high school, I seem to recall that Emily, my oldest daughter, might have been just going into, or maybe was in 8th grade, and my younger daughter might have been 7th grade or 6th grade. But suddenly, the family dinners got a little bit different, and my sense was that what I had wanted to happen, what you always want to happen with your kids, is you want them to understand that, of course, they do have private lives. They're not going to be the kids they were a year or two ago. They're not going to sit down at dinner and tell you everything that happened that day, because probably some painful things had happened that day. And I remember my daughter, Kate, my younger daughter, because I was the one that was home. Barbara, I was teaching at Colby College. Barbara was administrative assistant at Colby at the time. But I was usually the one that was there when my daughters came home. And I can remember Emily coming home and just, I might be upstairs working or whatever, and Emily would come home and she would slam the door so loud that the entire house would shake and yell at the top of her lungs, "My life sucks." And with Kate, it was a little different. Kate was always more private than that, but I was the one that was home, and I could see her when she rounded the corner at the end of our block. I could see her coming up the street toward me, and she carried, like kids did then. She had a backpack, and rather than decide what books to put in your locker, you put them all in the bag. And you carry them all home. And the book bag probably weighed half as much as she did, and I can still remember her coming around the corner, heading home, hunched over like this, under this enormous backpack. She was already beginning to show signs of scoliosis as a result of doing this. And I remember there was an expression on her face that terrified me, and that's the reason in that novel, in Empire Falls, I gave those things to Tick Roby. I gave her, the first time we see her, she's under that enormous backpack, struggling, and she's got this look on her face that tells you she has experienced something that day that she is not going to tell you that night or maybe ever. And so your child has exactly what you as a parent wants that child to have: a private life, a place that is theirs and theirs alone, and that neither you nor your wife nor anyone has any business mucking about in any more than this child wants you to do. And yet, on the other hand, if you don't go mucking about in there, and if there is something going on, something that is terrifying or disturbing in some way, how can you protect that child from something terrible happening? Long answer to your very short question about which book is your favorite. Empire Falls was the one that won the prize, and the Pulitzer is a gift that keeps on giving. There's no doubt about that.
So let's talk about that.
But that's what I remember about the book is my state of absolute panic about my daughters at that particular point in time. That's what I remember about Empire Falls more than anything else.
Well, it came out in 2001, in May of 2001, and we know what happened later that year. And it was hailed as, for some reason, one critic called it the last great novel of the 20th century. Well, I would say it's the first great novel of the 21st. And it's really a masterpiece. And so I don't know a lot of people. I mean, I know of people that have won Pulitzers, but I would just like to ask you, what was that like? What was it like when you got the call? And was there a ceremony? Did you attend that? I remember I was working for Random House, of course, and we were overjoyed for you. It was just like after everything that had happened in 2001, it was just a joyous occasion. So what was it like?
Well, I remember it. I remember it pretty vividly, actually. I was not expecting that call, for one thing, and I had every reason not to expect that call because, as you probably know, of the major book awards, major American book awards, the Pulitzer is the last. You get the short list, although back then I think it was just, the long list for the National Book Award comes out first, but I think back then, I don't think there was a long list. I think it was just the short list. So you get the National Book Award came out, and Empire Falls. If there was a long list, it didn't even make that, right? So that had come and gone. And then there's the National Book Critics Circle Award. That comes out with its long list, and it wasn't on that. What am I forgetting? There's another major one before the Pulitzer. Anyway, there is another one that comes out, and it wasn't on that list. And then the more regional book awards come out, like the New England Book Award, and it wasn't on the long list or the short list for even the regional ones, right? So I thought, I knew that the Pulitzer was going to be announced that day, but I thought, what sort of moron, given everything else that had transpired, who in the world would sit around and wait for the phone to ring that is clearly not going to ring? So I got my friend Jeff Colhoun and we've been playing tennis together for a long time. And so I said, let's play some tennis. So we went out, we played tennis for longer than we normally do. And it was a good match, and we played for probably like an hour and a half. And when we finished, I came home, I pulled into the driveway, and my wife came out and stood on the porch, and she looked really strange. She looked, and I looked at her, and I thought to myself, either someone we love has died, or I won the Pulitzer. Just the look on it, just the look on her face was. It was. I don't think I'd ever seen. We've been married a long time by that time, but I don't think I'd ever seen that look on her face before. And
Shocked? I mean, was it a look of shock, or was it?
Well, she was thrilled, but she was also very angry because the phone had been ringing for an hour while I was out there, and she's picking it up, and she would put the phone down, and it seemed like it was actually the act of putting the phone back in the cradle that made it ring again, because everybody was calling. My editor by that time had heard and was calling. Paul Newman had heard about it and had called to congratulate me. Old friends from high school, and they would come in in not the kind of order that you would expect. You know, it might be that old friend from high school, and then the Associated Press, and then the Bangor Daily News, and then, you know, so it just rang and rang and rang and rang. And the next day, we were scheduled to go to Spain, I believe, for my Spanish publisher. And so when I got back, I answered as many questions as I could. We were heading out the next day. We disconnected the phone and headed for the airport. And we were in Spain, I think, for like 4 or 5 days, maybe a week, something like that. And I thought when we came back at the end of that week or so, of course they'd heard over in Spain that I had won the Pulitzer, but they weren't interested in it. They weren't interested in it over there for that reason in particular. That doesn't make any difference. What I thought was, after we came back, of course, we plugged the phone back in, expecting that the ringing would begin again, because that was the only way we could get it to stop, was to unplug it. And we plugged it back in, and I don't think it rang again for 3 days. It was over. Nothing could have been more over than that, than that particular news, which changed our lives.
So I want to spend some time now talking about, what's called your masterpiece opus, the Fool's trilogy. Back in 1993, Nobody's Fool came out. Of course, that must have been a little life-changing in itself because it was made into the movie. And, I mean, it was a huge breakout, right? And you became friends with Paul Newman and, is it Robert Benton?
Robert Benton,
Yes.
with whom I worked on several
Yes.
projects.
And one of your books is dedicated to him. I can't remember which one right now. Empire? Yep.
Might be Empire Falls, yeah. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, you're right. I need
Yep.
to. Sorry.
Yep.
So if you would, for us, set up the trilogy
Oh,
and
yeah,
tell us a
yeah.
little about the timeline, tell
Yeah.
us all about North Bath and Schuyler Springs and
Yeah.
the Democrat. And I was thinking we could do a lightning round of I could just call things out from the books and you could elaborate, but that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah. Nobody's Fool just establishes the basic relationship of these two towns, North Bath and Schuyler Springs. Schuyler Springs, everybody noted right off the bat, was a stand-in for Saratoga Springs, which is not far from where I grew up in Gloversville, New York. And Schuyler Springs was a lucky town in that its springs, I mean, that was from the time when people would come to take the waters. They would drive up from New York City to Saratoga to take the waters, as they called it at the time. And those waters continued to percolate magically up from the ground. And suddenly Saratoga became known for other things. There was an arts colony there, and there was a racetrack. People would come up not only for the percolating waters, but also to go to the Saratoga racetrack. Had its own NPR affiliate up there. I mean, it was just a city that seemed to have everything in the world going for it. Whereas nearby Ballston Spa, also a spa town, as you can tell from its name, those waters ran dry, and so did their luck in every other way. And I was fascinated by that because I've always been fascinated by destiny in general. I've written so many of my most recent novels have dealt with destiny in some way or other because I consider my own to be so incredibly unlikely that I've just been fascinated by that. What are the components? Luck certainly has something to do with it. Fate certainly has something to do with it. And then there's that thing that we call free will, where we like to believe that our own choices, especially if we're successful, we like to believe that we're successful as a result of our own choices, not luck, right? Or not fate. But in these three novels, what we're seeing here is a kind of American story in which certain places and certain kinds of people flourish, and other people, for sometimes mysterious reasons like the spas running dry, but sometimes for other reasons, certain people, certain places, certain kinds of work seem for one reason or another to me not so lucky and to be left behind. So the framework of these stories is in that in the first book it just examines the lucky town versus the unlucky town. And by the time we get to Somebody's Fool, in the third and I think final version, the final of these North Bath books, In the last one, there is no North Bath. It has been incorporated by Schuyler Springs. So that's basically the timeline of these three novels.
So in the latest book, you touch on so many things. Did you write it during COVID? Did I read that somewhere?
I did.
But it's not really set in the present, right? It's set a few years back. But it's set during the Great
Recession.
Yes, that's
basically.
right.
Yeah.
So like 2008,
Yep.
2009.
Yep.
But I think you've got so many things that are going on, that were going on then, but I mean, they've been amplified in the last through the last years, entitlement, privilege, so many issues like that. And I urge you all to read it, because it just encapsulates so many of the social issues going on in our country and the way people deal with them.
Yeah, the things that you're talking about haven't happened to the characters in these Fool novels, but they have happened to us.
Yes.
Which means that when it comes time to write a book like that, the pandemic, everything that's happened to us, it's part of us. And so when you write a book that's taking place before that, those things factor in some way. And I had an idea for this book. And there are certain ways in which certain parts of this book simply could not be written as I originally intended. The Peter narrative, one of the things that's happened in this book is that Sully's son Peter has been trying to make his escape from North Bath for a very, very long time. He has the working title for this book, by the way, even though I always knew it was going to be called Somebody's Fool. The working title for this novel on my computer was Inheritance. And the Peter story is about inheritance. He inherits far more wealth from his father than he ever dreamed. He's inherited what his father still calls Miss Burrell's house, even though he has owned it for decades now. He inherits Miss Burrell's house, which Peter is renovating and intends to sell for a lot of money and finally make his escape from North Bath. But he's also inherited from his father a to-do list of people that he needs to look in on. If you've read the earlier books, you kind of know who's on that list. Ruth, Sully's longtime paramour, Rub Squeers, his squire in those first two books. All these people Sully has asked him to look in on. So he's got his father's to-do list. And of course, the other thing, the gift that keeps on giving in terms of inheritance is, of course, genetics. And Peter realizes, and if he didn't realize it, everybody is telling him that with each passing day, he looks more and more like his father when he gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror. So inheritance is part of it. And that part of the book didn't give me an awful lot of trouble. I kind of knew where I was going. There are two other major threads in the book. The second one is the one that gave me a problem, and that is the officer, chief of police Raymer story, because in the second of those novels, Raymer became a very important character, and in that book, he is the chief of police, and the woman that he is in love with, a beautiful black woman named Cherise, is the person that he has been trying to protect. She wants to get out. She wants to be on the police force. He's afraid that one day she's going to pull over the wrong driver or knock on the wrong door, and something terrible will happen to her, and it will be his fault. He's the chief of police, and finally he does let her out the door, and she becomes his best officer. But still, she is his best officer. And by the time this third book opens up, what I wanted to happen was for there to be the roles to be reversed. Great comic premise, right? In the second book, he's her boss, but now in the third book, since North Bath is going to be gobbled up, there's no real reason anymore for a chief of police there. So Raymer is now without a job. Charisse has been hired to be the chief of police in Schuyler Springs because there have been a few racial incidents in Schuyler Springs, and they think a black police chief of police might be just what's needed there. And so she will now be his boss. What's wrong with that as a comic premise? Perfect. No problem at all. Except, of course, speaking of those things that have happened to all of us that have not yet happened to these particular characters, what happened, of course, was George Floyd's murder, which meant I realized quite quickly that the book that I had intended to write could not be written, at least not the way I intended it, because things had changed. For one thing, it would no longer be possible, I don't think, to have a book about two black police officers or two police officers, one black, one white, who are involved in, who are still in love, and both very good police officers. Even Chief of Police Raymer, who has been convinced his entire life that he's a fool. He's been told by everybody, and he is prone to foolish mistakes. There's no question about it. But he is, in fact, a very good police officer, a very good chief of police, and he's going to prove it, just how good he is in this book. But it wasn't possible anymore, I don't think, to have a book about two good police officers without a suggestion that there are other kinds of cops out there. And so I had to create Delgado, this truly, truly malignant force. And over the three novels, if you read them, I think that you will find that each of them gets darker than the last. In the first Fool novel, people have problems, but evil as a force does not really present itself. By the time we get to the second book, evil in a fairly pure form does manifest itself in a couple of ways. And in the third book, evil is there on just about every page. And so Delgado, for one thing, this vicious racist cop had to be invented. But it also seemed to me that the arc of Raymer's story had to be different too, because in the first book, his relationship with Charisse, it was just that he happened to be white, she happened to be black, and it was nobody's business but theirs. But the world had changed now, and so the arc of Raymer's story had to change with it. In some way or other, it had to, the issue had to be addressed that the world was simply not going to leave them alone in that circumstance anymore. And so that issue had to be addressed in a way that it didn't have to be in the first couple of books.
And Charisse has a twin, and you find out in Everybody's Fool that they have always taken care of each other. And her twin, Jerome, the name's Bond, Jerome Bond.
The name is Bond. Jerome Bond.
He is this really, elegant, put together dude, and Everybody's Fool. But he's having some problems in the third book. And that is one of the things that I loved about the book so much, is when Raymer and Jerome, Charisse's brother, the black man, they sit down together, and Jerome explains to Raymer what it's like to be black. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but with everything going on, it's just such a beautiful, I think, distillation that encapsulates it really in one page of the book. So I don't know if you want to talk about that. But
oh, I'd love to. If there is a love story in this book, it's It's the one between Raymer and Jerome. I mean, Raymer is still very much in love with Charisse, but that was never in doubt. Even though they've taken a time out in their relationship, and Raymer does not understand why. Part of it is that Jerome has returned, and Raymer doesn't know that, and for a very long time, because Jerome has always been fighting. Even in the earlier books, Jerome's problem is obsessive compulsive disorder, which I know a little bit about because it cuts a very, very wide swath through my own family. And Jerome suffers terribly from obsessive compulsive disorder. And every time he breaks up he always thinks that love is going to save him, and he falls in love at the drop of a hat, often with white women. And every time one of them breaks up with him, he spirals into the worst kind of OCD behavior.
And he has to be careful because they're all going to fall in love with him.
Yes,
and he's
Jerome believes
trying to
that
protect.
that's so he takes to wearing things like Raymer's ugly cardigan sweater to prevent white women from falling in love with him. But yeah, the wonderful thing about, without giving too much away here, the wonderful thing about the Jerome Raymer story here is that each of these men needs something that the other has, and neither of them could make this journey on their own. They can only do it together, and even then they have to get lucky a couple of times to make this work. But what I love most about their relationship was that I could take that I could take a very, very dark subject. This book is full of the same subject matter as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Those parts of the American character that we like to pretend sometimes aren't there. The racism, the violence, the ignorance that seems to motivate people inescapably. And to be able to investigate those very dark parts of those very dark aspects of the American character, but to do it in what I hope is just drop dead funny scenes. That was for me, at least, a large part of the joy of this book, is just watching these two men who are arguably fools in the broadest sense of that term find their way to wisdom.
Well said. So the books, they have dark themes, but they also have so much humor. And I don't know if any of you listen to audio books, but they are hysterically funny. I mean, I was riding down the road laughing all the way back from Nashville to Jackson the other day when I was re-listening to something. So those are great too. And did you pick the narrator for the audios?
No.
Had nothing to do with it? Okay.
No.
Okay. Can you talk about...
Those people are wonderful, though. They're so good at their jobs. People have told me how fortunate I've been with the people who have read my novels, done the narration for my novels over the years. I mean, they're just wonderful.
They really are.
Yeah.
They really are. So one of the things that I was reading about in your book of essays is kindness and the moral imagination. Could you talk a little bit about that in the overall picture of your work?
Yeah, and the older I get, the more convinced I am that nothing much matters besides kindness. And there's a way in which kindness, I think, connects to moral imagination. In some way, it's a demand that is made upon writers, I think. We're being asked I think, something fairly basic to imagine what it's like to live somebody else's life, somebody who's maybe not that much like us. It's interesting that right now I'm reading another memoir by a dear friend of mine, Jennifer Finney Boylan, who will have her new memoir will probably be out sometime next year. And this one is just wrecking me. And one of the reasons is that her journey, which you may know something about, Jenny is transgender, and she has become over the years a spokesperson for the transgender community, and I think done it with great courage and devotion. And now, like me, Jenny, our friendship goes back to early days at Colby College, where my office mate was Jim Boylan. And I went with Jenny and Dee Dee for Jim's then gender reassignment surgery. And we have remained dear friends. What has, now she's she's dealing with the same things that she's always dealt with, but in addition to that, now dealing with not just being a woman, finally, which she had known she was since she was 6 years old. She's now dealing with the fact, not just the fact that she's finally a woman living in a woman's body, but also getting old like the rest of us. And so it's not just one problem anymore. All of these things have come together. But the thing that has been most difficult, I think, for Jenny, before transition, during transition, after transition, the thing that's been the most difficult for her is that for some people, what we writers think of as moral imagination is just so difficult, because what she always says, what is so difficult about this? I mean, nature is so various. And yet for some people, it's just so difficult for her and people like her. It's just so difficult for them to put themselves in her shoes. The very thing that I think writers, what we refer to as moral imagination, absolutely demands of us at a time when, in fact, that moral imagination is, I think, at times under assault. You know, there are people who say, well, here's something that this isn't really yours to imagination. This isn't yours to imagine. This belongs to somebody else. For me, it's always just been the bedrock of the storyteller. I mean, one of the first stories that I wrote, one of my favorite stories, because I don't write that many stories. They all turn into novels. But one of the first stories that I wrote was about an octogenarian Belgian nun, Sister Ursula. She's one of my favorite characters. Well, needless to say, I'm getting, when I wrote about this octogenarian, I was probably 40 years old. I visited Belgium. I'm never going to be a nun. What possible business could I have writing at that time or any other time about an octogenarian Belgian nun? And all I can say in response to that, do I have a right to? I don't know. It just feels not so much a right as an obligation. And these obligations of moral imagination, they're they're not rights, they're obligations. We simply, if you give that up, if I can't do that, I'm out of business. I'm taking selfies, right?
I'm so glad that you just talked about all of that, because I really do think it's something that we're going to have to deal with. So do you think this is really the last one?
I do. And I was so interested in listening to Richard's, because of course one of the reasons that I wanted to be there is I wanted to hear what he was going to have to say about a lot of things, but I had a sneaking suspicion that Richard, like me, is one of the things he's being asked all the time. Is it really the last? Is it really the last? And Richard responded in the way that I expected him to. That as far as he was concerned, yeah, it probably is. And I think that this is the last of my Fool books. But I didn't expect to write the second, and it took me 2.5 decades. I never expected to write that. I did expect to write the third. I don't expect to write the fourth, but I will say this. I've been on the road now, on book tour for about, close to a month now, and every single place I've gone, people have pitched me ideas for the fourth Fool book, and they're not all bad. So never say never. Every time I've said never, I've been wrong. So, but it does feel like it feels like the end.
For now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. This, by the way, as some of you I'm sure know, this is the harder seat. My daughter has a bookstore in Portland where I live, and I do a lot of interviewing of authors in her store. I never sweat being in this chair. I do sweat being in that one. It's much more difficult, and you feel like
you made it easy. He just knows I was a nervous wreck. I don't do this, but I did, and I'm so proud of myself. And it was really an honor. It's absolutely one of my favorite writers. Richard will be signing at 4:15 in the tent, and good luck if you're going over there. I know it's still hot, right? Forever. Thank you.
Thank you.